great topics here tonight and an amazing panel of millennial leaders. And so before we begin, I will be doing an overview on just to kind of cement our discussion. And before I do that, I do want to introduce our great roster of panelists. And they're going to be coming to you one by one. And I'll introduce their names and then they'll take over, they'll introduce themselves and then we'll get started. So Keturah Morris, if you want to like start us off. I know Keturah Morris comes to us from the city of Hamilton. And we're just gonna ask you just to come on, just unmute yourselves and introduce yourselves to this audience.
Hey everyone, good evening. So glad to be a part of this panel. I am, of course, a millennial. I was born in Toronto. Of course, I am the daughter of a bishop and first lady, so I'm a PK. I attended the University of Toronto. Some fun facts about me: I play basketball, I love to swim, I love to have fun. What else? I love to sing. I also do worship and praise. I direct choirs in the community as well as the church. So I'm just happy to lend my voice any way that I can. So I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Welcome, Keturah. And next up, Najula Davis attends Kingdom Life, I believe from Toronto. I think you were born in Toronto, but let's see.
Yes, I was born in Toronto. So as first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a part of such wonderful people talking and having a great discussion on the church from the perspective of the millennials. As some of you already know, I am Najula Davis, born and raised in Toronto. I attend Kingdom Life Ministries. I went to York University, and then I went on to pursue my master's in education. I am an educator. My passion is youth and young people. I do serve at Kingdom Life Ministries as a youth leader, as the youth president there, to I Emerge Ministries. And I am also a part of the praise team. And I also serve with leadership there as an evangelist. So I endeavor just to use whatever God has given me to spread the gospel, the gifts that he gives me, and continuously challenge in different ways. So my passion in my regular everyday life is youth, and now in church is the same thing. So I try to mesh the two and see where it takes me from then on. So that is pretty much me in a nutshell. I also am married to an amazing man, Adrian Davis, who is the greatest supporter and pusher to me in everything that I do. So that's about it in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you, Najula. And all the way from Edmonton, Alberta, we have Rohan Samuels.
How's it going, everybody? I am Rohan Samuels, as it was just mentioned. Again, Dr. Spencer, and to her team, thank you for having me and alongside with the other guest panelists to join in this, I believe, pertinent conversation as we deal with critical issues, albeit being in a pandemic, but amidst how we navigate that through our spiritual journey in our lives. I guess a little bit about me. Born in Toronto, moved to Alberta to pursue. Well, I actually moved just to visit my dad for 2 weeks. I got accepted into a seminary and where I pursued my master's, and I've been here ever since. I met my beautiful wife, Janelle Samuels, my beautiful wife, and we're doing it all good over here on this side. God has allowed me to venture into pastoring, and so I pastor the greatest church in Edmonton, Alberta, Freedom Life Church. And also, with that being said, I'm pursuing a doctorate degree at Evangelical in Myerstown, Pennsylvania, where I am studying contextual theology. And so I got a lot on my plate. And so time is really of the essence. And but I'm grateful to be in this conversation. And I've always been passionate about youth. As a matter of fact, my doctoral focus is to develop a postmodern hermeneutic for Black millennials. And so, anything involved in millennials, the Black church, philosophy, and theology is pretty much, my kind of sphere of conversation. And so I'm glad to be a part of this conversation and, hear from these brilliant men and women and their insights.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Jody Bent, True Holiness.
So, hello, I'm Jody Bent. I am just a simple girl that loves to worship the Lord and to praise the Lord. I love God. He's the head of my life. Just a short summary of me. I was born in Jamaica, and I came here at a young age, and I've been under the leadership of the late Apostle Samuels, the Lord rest his soul, currently our pastor, Pastor Fisher, True Holiness Apostolic Temple. I've been there since I was a child, a part of that membership, and I have had various positions and areas in the church that I've worked with young people mainly, also with the music ministry, choir, praise team, and the list goes on. My passion is young people. For my career, I am a child and youth practitioner. I work for the school board, and I work with troubled, at-risk, and behavioral youth with special needs. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to come on this platform tonight to speak on the issues and the events, our current events, and able to just help young people in any way possible. Pray my strength, and I hope that we have a wonderful night tonight. God bless.
Okay, we will pray your strength, Sister Jody. And right here from Toronto, from Rhema Christian Ministry, Mikhail Tulloch.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mikhail Tulloch. As Dr. Spencer shared, I hail from the city of Toronto, Ontario. I worship at Rhema Christian Ministries under the tutelage of Pastor Meikle, and I also serve there as the youth and young adults leader of Plugged In Rhema, currently pursuing my graduate studies in the area of divinity. And I really have a passion for the church and really being a bridge, being both a product of the Black church and also being a millennial. I really have a passion for bridging the generations together and seeing meaningful engagement and connection between the intergenerational church. So I'm excited to be here, looking forward to conversing with each of the brilliant minds that are on this panel. And thank you, Dr. Spencer.
And you're welcome. And that concludes our introductions. I believe I've gotten everyone from our panel. Thank you all very much. And so now what we want to move to is to do a little overview on, many of you are hearing this term Black Church in Canada. Ironically, the Louis Gates documentary on PBS has been airing since this week, and it's going to be continuing. And everyone's been messaging me about that. And it's amazing that how the African Americans are very clear about the historical impacts of the Black churches there, given their 400, 300 years of enslavement there, and how the Black churches was really the beacon of Blacks there. But here in Canada, outside of the Indigenous Black Canadians on the East Coast, very little has been written or said about the impacts of Black churches there. And I kind of wanted to just do a little overview, but what do we mean by the Black church? The Black church, you'll find that nowhere in the Bible. So for everyone that's like, okay, why are we talking about? No, it's not. It's a sociological term. And I just kind of wanted to do that overview. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Terrell if you're ready to just cue that video. In the mid-1950s, Canada began liberalizing immigration policies and opening the doors to immigrants from non-European countries. The change in policy was to address acute labor shortages as white women moved out of menial types of employment to jobs that offered better working conditions. In 1955, the Canadian government introduced the West Indian Domestic Scheme, which allowed eligible Black women who were between the ages of 18 to 35 in good health, no family ties, and a minimum of grade ate education. They came from countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and other islands in the Caribbean. And as a result of this new policy, Canada experienced an astronomical influx of immigrants from the Caribbean. Incident after incident, many experienced racism. Left with the option to either return home to practice their faith or remain under these racist conditions, Raphael Jones decided to step out and start the first Afro-Caribbean Pentecostal church of the Apostolic Faith in 1963. As a result, hundreds of churches across Canada, out of this Afro-Caribbean experience, burst forward alongside the patterns of immigration. And today, we salute the sacrifice and dedication of these great Caribbean pioneers. They were singers. They were immigration advocates, entrepreneurs, social workers, caregivers, preachers, supporters, who united to ensure that the settlement of Blacks into Canada would be supported and encouraged during these periods of assimilation. They worked together in unity to lay a path, to lay a foundation for generations to come. And today we salute our Caribbean pioneers, their families, their children, and all of those laboring across Canada. So that was just a little clip just to give the whole historical about the influx of the Caribbeans, which many of us are descendants of. The Afro-Caribbean Church, what I mean by that term, Black Church, are the descendants that came to Canada, or the immigrants that came to Canada, primarily from Jamaica and Barbados. Most of the churches are coming out of Jamaica. And what was so fascinating about the Caribbean migration is very different to the Indigenous Black Canadians that came through the Underground Railroad. I'm sure many of you are probably participating in a lot of Black church history, Black history events, given it's Black History Month, where, they talk a lot about, Black settlements, where they came. And when you score through a lot of the literature, very little has been spoken about what a lot of the Caribbean contributions have been here in Canada. And I'm here to kind of change that narrative and let people know that there's a 60-year history of Black contribution from the Black church persuasion of the Afro-Caribbean community. So when we think about the Black church, first of all, define it, a Black church is any church organization that has been led by Black people. They form as ethnic enclaves beyond the religious persuasion in terms of teaching people about the word of God. They were institutions that formed in protest to racism, in protest to discrimination, where many of them came to Canada. Actually, most of them migrated to Canada, those who came here in the 50s. It was all about coming here for a better life, right? Because as a colonial country under the British system, they were allowed to travel, and Canada was like one of the British colonial countries that many came. They either went to England or here in Canada, and many also into the United States. And so they came here for a better life. They came here for better job opportunities, and that was the narrative of both of them. Now, as they were attending churches in Jamaica, I'll say Jamaica because that's where most of them came from, they brought with them their faith. Right? So they came to Canada, those in the 50s. There was no other, let's just say, apostolic church as they knew it from the Jamaican experience that started in 1919. A lot of the immigrants came out of the Shiloh churches. A lot of them came out of the Bishop Watson churches. And these are like leaders who were around from the 1930s and 40s. And when they came here, there was only one church they can go to that matched their faith. And as the video said, so many of them had very unpleasant experiences of racism. For an example, they were a minister back home, maybe used to being participants in the church service, not being allowed to express themselves. One pastor sharing with me in interviews I conducted during my research that they wouldn't wash their feet. The Black people's feet was considered dirty. Some of them were told to sit on other sides of the congregation. And they did, not knowing, there's no option. And as they continue to unfold, after being asked to sit on one side of the church, they were then asked, well, would you like to worship on a different day? It got so unbearable for many of them that they were just like, we can't do this anymore. They would reach back sometimes to their leaders back in Jamaica to say, what should we do? And in the case of one incident where it was the Bishop Raphael Jones, he just said, you know what, I'm going back home. I have jobs in Jamaica. I can build a life there because this is just way too, as in his words, insipid for me. But he said, as he began to move up to say, you know, we're going to go back home, he said the Lord spoke to him and says, no, start a church. And what was said at that time was a Black man can't start a church. The only thing in their minds at the time was that it only could be led by white leaders. And so courageously, Raphael Jones, and that is Bethel Apostolic Church, he launches out in 1963 and said, really, I'm going to start a church. And the rest is history. These men it's incredible information and experiences that they share with me, and me also going across the nation and just interviewing people about what did they do during those times? Like, what was the impact, right? You know, I learned about how they would buy homes to help single women so that they wouldn't have to pay large rents, right? They were on the roster at Canada Immigration. So when a Black person came to the airports, they would call them. It was just like the YMCA welcome house, that they were like pseudo social workers, where they would call them and say, Reverend, one of your people are here down at immigration. And I mean, and this was what a lot of them were doing. They would house people, they would feed people, help people find jobs, etc. And so it is this disconnect, I think, sometimes historically, that we don't really understand where we're coming from generation to generation. And also because a lot of the churches, as we see it now across Canada, a lot of the pastors are aging. And so there's an absence of literature, absence of oral transference from one generation to the next. And so tonight, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be kicking off our discussion about the role today, right? So yes, they were so involved, and yes, they were helping with immigration. Yes, they were housing people, but 2021, here we are. And now people are turning to the church to say, well, why aren't you doing this? Or why aren't you speaking out here? And if for anyone that's interested, it's important that we know that we cannot always take our cues from the United States experience in terms of the Martin Luther King, who really, you know, merged his faith with the social activism, right? 300 years of enslavement, their greats who came over on ships and so forth. Whereas there was a different triangulation in terms of the slaves that went to Jamaica, and then through push and pull factors of immigration came to Canada. So their presence in Canada, it was kind of experience was like, wow, Trudeau let us in, right? We have this great opportunity to settle here, and this is why to this day they vote Liberal, right? Because of the gratitude that they have. So they really engage in social issues very, very differently. And also that everything for them was Jesus-centric. They don't want to give you a job, well, you know, they pray on it. You know, they fast on it, as opposed to sometimes understanding how to fight within the system. So we're going to open up tonight with a very pressing issue, because many of us in our workplaces, outside of the church, we are experiencing a lot of you know, some people are calling it trauma on top of trauma with COVID-19 in terms of the experiences of the public execution of George Floyd and subsequent protests that was happening in Toronto and right across the world. And people are asking youth leaders, well, how come the church isn't talking about this? And that's our first topic for tonight. Why was the Black church silent? This is what we're hearing from the youth. We're hearing from others. Were they silent? Why were they silent during the racial protests? That's our first topic for tonight. Let's start.
I think that's a great question to be asked, and I'm sure that everyone that's on this panel and that's in this chat, or this conversation, can agree that there is a bit of a silence from the Canadian Black church, and let's just specify that more so compared to, you know, our brothers and sisters from the South. And I would say that there are several factors. And I mean, you know, we can spend all night and all day really wrestling with these, but from my experiences, I'm just going to speak from my experiences. I kind of have maybe 2 or 3 reasons why there was a level of silence when it came to the communication of social justice from our pulpits. The first thing that I identified was, number one, um, it's not regularly communicated from our pulpits. Uh, we can't only bring up, or at least bring attention to, or highlight social justices and or injustices only during Black History Month, when throughout the entire full year there are injustices that are happening perpetually. But also it's a blend of our social action and our theology. If our theology doesn't incorporate any sort of social involvement, if it doesn't speak to, as what Luke 4:18 tells us, if it doesn't speak to the marginalization of people, if it doesn't speak to the oppression and to the suppression, and the demise in some way of people, if that's not incorporated in our theology and our gospel, then we're not going to regularly communicate that. And so this is where we see the silence, when we see the culture really pushing this social justice agenda, but yet in our perspective and in our sphere, we're silent. That is a problem. And I believe, and I will argue, that the church has indeed the most succinct and potent solution to social injustices. And that is the gospel. And there has to be a way where we're able to communicate the gospel, but also allow the gospel to be relational to the actual felt need. So it's number one, our sermons, our communication, our pulpits, it has to regularly incorporate the conversation of the social injustices. Yes, it may be difficult, but we have to bring light to our young Black men that are being carded, or the whole process of carding. We have to bring light to our young Black man falsely being stopped by the police officer just because of the car that they drive, or because of the kind of clothing that they wear, or the whole idea of stereotypes that have been labeled on them. Those things have to be mentioned, and it's sad because these are the lived experiences that our families deal with. These are lived experiences that our young Black men and across the spectrum have to deal with. So I believe, number one, it's not something that's communicated on the pulpit. Number two, and this is what I will argue, that there is a level of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what this is what I see, is that there's maybe a possible escapism syndrome that's going on, where we strictly focus on leaving this world, and then we don't pay attention to engaging in the world. So many of what we're, and ain't nothing wrong with it. If that's our eschatology, that if we're focused on being raised up, we sing them songs that we're about to be caught up to meet him. And that's perfectly fine. We believe that theologically, but we should not allow that level of theology allow us to be totally absent from the lived experiences of certain realities. We shouldn't be so focused on not leaving when we got present day issues that we got to wake up to that's being ignored. And I remember I preached a sermon a long time ago, talked about vacant pulpits. And one of the issues that we as a church need to address is that we have social organizations filling up the pulpits that we at the church should be occupying. And I'm talking about the pulpits dealing with social injustice. I'm talking about pulpits dealing with the poverty. I'm talking about pulpits dealing with classism and elitism in our culture, in our context. But we have social organizations that are filling those spaces, which I believe the church should absolutely be equipped and prepped to situate themselves in those spaces. So I would argue, and I'm pretty sure there are many other reasons, but I will argue that there is a level of escapism, and also it's the social justice conversations, and in terms of how we preach a lived experience is not regularly preaching on pulpits. And I can support that. And I'm not too sure if everybody saw the actual documentary, but one of the identities of the hallmarks of the Black church, and one of the purpose was there's, Dr. Barber mentioned that there's the church, the Black church has three purposes. I think one of them is the prophetic witness to social justice, holiness, and also spiritual empowerment through worship. That was pretty much the foundational purposes of the Black church that is in the United States. And I do believe that transcends into our context as Canadian, or at least, within North America in general, that there's a level of holiness that we definitely need to maintain, that we absolutely subscribe to. But also there's an actionable step of being socially involved in our context as a part of the witness, as a part of the prophetic witness, and also through our worship. That's an expression of our liberation and our freedom. But I think it can't just be one-sided. I believe that there has to be much more further engagement in the preach word that brings the reality and the experiences, and we actually minister to the reality of the context that we're dealing with in our pews.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Who else wants to join on that? Because I mean, there was a lot said there in terms of the escapism and this disconnect in terms of not infusing that within the ways of preaching. What do other panelists have to add to that?
If I may, I remember when we spoke prior in our meeting, Dr. Lane Spencer, you enlightened us by letting us know that a lot of the leaders who you just reflected on in the video, that they shared of their personal experiences with racism. And I believe that, I think you said some of them would get signs on their windows when they were opening church. I think that they had their own like personal face-to-face experience. And I think they had to find a way to maneuver because they were still coming in as immigrants and then establishing themselves with their family personally, and then also trying to establish themselves within the church, like, bringing a church institution and bringing what they know from their Caribbean experience. So I feel like for them, I think after hearing, I did have another perspective, but after you shed light on the fact that they experienced their own racism in a different way, I feel like the silence also may be due to the fact that they found I feel like their strategy had to be different. Whereas for us, we were born in Canada. We get education, like we have a lot of opportunities that come to us because we are Canadians. Even if you're coming from Jamaica and like now it's just a different time. So I feel like their lack also has to do with how they experience racism then. I'm not trying to give it a permission, like, you know what I mean? I'm not trying to say that, but I do feel like the way we experience racism kind of allows us to handle it in a different way. So I think because they were establishing themselves, and who knows, maybe they did protest back then. Maybe they found different ways. They had different strategies. I would be curious to know how they did that. And I think you, Dr. Elaine, would be able to speak to that. But I do think that because of how we faced it, we are more bold because we had more opportunities. We were born with more opportunities. We are not coming from one place to another and trying to establish ourselves. There's a lot that our parents have already done for us, which gives us a sense of not only entitlement, but I think they give us confidence. They have, now they install in us what they want us to be that they weren't. And I think they want us to go in certain areas that they could not. And so now here we are to take it to the next level, I would say.
Can I interject? Sorry, can I share my points with what Sister Najol has said just now? I think that it's important to recognize the struggle, to their experience, what they endured and what they went through. I think that's very plain. Some people don't understand the history of it. And I think that's why we're here tonight, which is a great opportunity to learn what some of our forefathers went through with the racism and all the things that they had to go through. We cannot like go away from that fact. They went through it and it happened. However, now, because of the silencing and because of not speaking on it, we don't have an understanding of it. So the fact that they went through it, that in itself is hard enough. However, I think that because you experienced it, it should have been told. You know what I mean? You should have found a way to let those that were coming up under your leadership know that you went through some hard stuff. Like we hear it, but we don't really understand the history as to what our older leaders and those men of God and women of God went through when they first came here. So I'm thinking with what Brother Rohan was saying, yes, you had the experience. However, not sharing, we don't understand. We don't know what happened to you. We don't know, you know what I mean? Those social things that took place and the racism, we don't understand that. And silence is not the answer. It's to speak up about these things. We're in the world, but we're not of it, but we're still here. So even though we had some experiences of things that happened to us, I think that's the perfect opportunity to teach and to let our voice be heard and to see where we're coming from and where we are today. It will be great if we had these leaders speak up just from their experience and then have a group of people now that they're leading to stand in that strength and to stand with that strong voice that we're not going to tolerate that anymore, or that was our history and this is where we're moving into something else. So the silence is not really helping us. It should have been a time for us to come together and understand it and then find a way to navigate through those ages and times. But we're here today, and that's why we're here, to make a difference and a change.
So not just silence in the protesting, but silence within in terms of not transferring their experience. Like what do you think that's about? Like why aren't they speaking to? Go ahead, Keturah.
I think I'm gonna kind of go on the other side of things. When I'm looking at the demographics of our pastors now, we're talking about the Black church in Canada. We want to talk about it in our GTA area. Looking at the demographics of our pastors or leadership, a lot of them are, let's say, 60 and above. That's not to say that being 60 and above means that you're not involved in, you're not socially aware. However, I do feel with our pastors, there is and I think Rohan was kind of alluding to this, but I do feel that there is a hands-off mentality in our churches where it is more spiritual than it is social awareness. Everything is, which is great. I totally believe in it, heaven, hell. However, I do feel that there's something missing when it comes to the social aspect of our churches. We're not as involved as I think that we should be. I don't feel that we are, if we were to ask how many pastors did any sort of protests, I'm sure there probably won't be a lot of pastors that were involved in protests. I think our age group, more so the millennials, are certainly more, the terminology is more woke, I guess, more aware of what's happening. We're more, involved when it comes to watching the news, seeing what's going on social media. We're hearing a lot more than probably some of our leaders are hearing. And I don't think that is to fault them. I just feel that they're in a certain time frame that I think sometimes it is preventing them from, I think, being more active socially, being more present, I think, to what's happening outside of the four walls of church. And again, it's not to their shame. I just think sometimes we got to kind of compartmentalize where they are and see with them, as we would say. So our young people, I think that we have a more sense of what's happening in our world. And I think that gives us a little bit more push to want to speak up more. And I think personally, I think that that's kind of missing in our churches. Just my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. To add to that, I think that one of the things that we see, especially with conversations surrounding social injustice and justice, is that there's a chasm between the generations now. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of our forefathers, especially now having a better understanding of the history, through what you've chronicled, Dr. Spencer, we see that they have had their experiences, and perhaps one of the reasons as to why they are more silent, not dismissing the silence, is because of the fact that they grew up in a time where suffering was not openly spoken of. You didn't show the areas that you were wounded in, even though I see a distinction and a difference between wounds and scars, in that, like, you can teach from the scars in order to equip the next generation as to how to more meaningfully engage. But given the school of thought that many of them came up in, it was, you would cover those things. You wouldn't speak on those things. And I think another factor to consider as well is that this is one of the first times in history that we've seen that, with conversations surrounding injustices, surrounding oppression, right, that the church is not leading the conversation. And I think that there may be a measure of fear for some of our older leaders to engage in conversations or in movements where the church is not leading at the forefront. But I would say that it begs the question, and maybe this is a conversation that we will have, or maybe we'll be able to dive into this now, like what that can look like, meaningful engagement. As Pastor Rohan alluded to, having social justice, not just as a subject that we discussed in February, not just discussing the atrocities that happened to our people in Black History Month, but how can we infuse our theology and our teaching with the reality of what is going on, not just having church being a place where we are pacified and where we escape, but even if we do come out and be separate, can we come out, and can we be equipped to go back in more effectively with the hope of the gospel, but also engaging with the realities of our time? Because I think what we see now is that a generation has risen that, for many of them, many within our generation, right, it's not that we don't believe in prayer, but when you hear just pray about it, and as Keturah said, like the spiritualizing, the hyper spiritualizing, to us, that almost sounds, to many within our generation, it sounds as though prayer is a means of dismissal, right? As opposed to praying for strategy to meaningfully engage, we pray, trust that God will handle it so that we don't have to, the hands-off approach. But I think that we have to see that prayer is not a means of escape, but it should equip us as we seek the Lord for strategy as to how to more meaningfully engage. And just because we are the church and we believe in a hope, because we have a hope of the life that is to come, does not mean that we should not have a voice or a presence in the now. Because I think our silence, right, and our lack of engagement, it sends a message to the world that, although this is not the intent of our leaders, it sends a message to the world that we don't care. So I think it's something that we need to rethink, that we need to explore as to what that looks like.
Go ahead.
Okay, I totally agree. I just wanted to add that I believe, so if we were going to look at scripture, and I want to just allude to at least one particular person in scripture, that's Joseph. I know we preach Joseph, like we preach Joseph from a deliverance, like from a, slums to riches narrative, started from the bottom, now we here, that kind of thing, from the pit to the palace. Like we use all of these fancy words, but if we actually look at the story of Joseph, he was strategically placed in the palace for the furtherance of the social and the political stability of Egypt. As a matter of fact, Joseph was the one who saved Egypt from a mass famine that hit the land. And so it goes, for me, I think what's important is that I'm praying that our generation and those preceding or who's preceding after us will conceptualize this, that our jobs and our careers are so vital and it has kingdom attachment association to it that we don't even know it. That I know, many of us, I don't know, I'm speaking from my experience, that my mom wanted me to go to school to be a doctor or, a doctor or lawyer, and which is fine. Right? That's, go to school to be a doctor and a lawyer. Like that's what you're supposed to do. And that's super dope. But I believe that we have to be, and I agree with what Elder McCare is saying, that we have to be strategically placed where the church, not just the structure of the church, but actually the embodiment of the ecclesia, that we are strategically placed in government. How many of us even know our local government that's within the sphere of our church? How many of us have allowed the mayor and or any sort of bureaucrat come to our churches? So we want these particular reforms and changes, not knowing that we have to actually do the work and be much more involved in being able to place and have our voice within the political sphere. And I think that's critical. That if we're going to tackle racism, I'll say this before I let Najol go. One of the hallmarks and the identity of the Black preacher, coming up within the 1800s, in the 1950s and 60s, was that the Black minister was also the political voice for the people. He was not just the preacher. He was not just the one who preached on Sunday, but he was the actual political leader. He was the leader for the entire, community. So they looked to him for spiritual food. They looked to him for social engagement. They looked to him for economic support in some essence. And so I believe that our ministries have to be holistic. It just can't be focused on one area and dynamic, and then to expect the change. We have to be vocal in the community. The community has to know us. Like if our church been around and the local network, the local shop don't know our church been there, then that's a problem. Like we can't talk about changing the world if the local restaurant don't even know we exist in there. So I think it's important that we have to be much more involved. Sometimes it may be like sometimes we have to innovate our services. Maybe in some essence, we don't have Sunday morning services within the building, but it's a community effort. Maybe sometimes, I know that may be controversial, but if the ecclesia is not attached to the infrastructure of the building, then that simply means that we're not defined by the infrastructure of the building. And so I think being able to have our voices that just proceeds from Sunday morning. Where's our voice like from Monday to Saturday, right? And I think that's important for us to conceptualize as we talk about. And I'm not burdening our leaders. They've done what they need to do. But I want to transition to how we as millennials and also Gen Z, how do we strategically place ourselves in the positions, not just within the church alone, but within our schools, within our community, to be the Joseph, right? Because he wasn't effective just in the synagogue, he was in Egypt. But he was effective in the palace, right? And so that's where his influence came from.
Thank you. Jola.
Sorry. I just wanted to add, because I really love the fact that Pastor Rohan, you had mentioned that, what we're doing as millennials, and that we need to basically be the change that we want to see. But one thing that I wanted also, to basically echo, if I may, is just that we need to stop thinking of our Black history as beginning with slavery. I feel like we need to, because I will say with my youth, I have decided going forward with the team that going forward, just to add to, I can't remember who said it first, but that we've already acknowledged Black History Month is not going to be the only time that we talk about Black history, right? It can't be just February. So we've decided going forward all year long, with everything we do going forward, with every activity, whatever we do, we're going to implement a little bit of Black history, a little bit of education on what excellence looks like in the past and what it still looks like now. Because I think what happens is there's a lack of representation that our youth are seeing, right? And I think what happens is we have a tendency to get so passionate about the social injustice, as we should. And we get very passionate about the racism that we're experiencing, but then there's an absence to who we are. How did we start? How did our ancestors start in Africa? You know what I mean? I think we just need to pay more attention. I think, I wouldn't say change the narrative, but add to it. You know what I mean? And I think that if we can just start to see the positive about it as well, we won't be so overwhelmed with what's happening. Because I think sometimes when you see it, it hurts, right? It's traumatizing. It's something that we can't negate. But I do feel like we just also have to add to what defines us. It's not slavery. You know what I mean? So that's what I think that we also have to do, is just, it's obsolete in the schools. And yes, it's something that we haven't been seeing in the church, but us as youth leaders, youth pastors, you know, the millennials that you don't even have to have a title. Your contribution, whatever you do in work and in church, let it include what is missing in the church. You know what I mean? So now we have the opportunity to change what we see that's lacking and reposition that in our position now in society and in the church.
So in thinking this a little bit further, I wonder if there is a disconnect with generations in terms of how they work through social problems. Because I think there's this notion that because leaders were silent or I mean, visually silent, right? And I remember asking this years ago. Some of their responses are that, do you know how many people, how many youth we've helped from, the drug, being in drugs or dropping out of schools or the after school. And I wonder if this thing with the prosperity movement that happened about the 90s, there seems to be this disconnect that people don't recognize. And I think it goes right back to the transference of history of what they did. And I think the Gen Xers, many of them who did pass through, who did go to school, who did engage in social movements and brought it to churches. I mean, I could think growing up about forums that were out there and telling you, you can do all things through Christ and there's no job out there you can't get, but it was very insular, right? It was in the community of the church. It wasn't the public protest, because for them, the Caribbeans, even in the United States, have a very different way. It's a similar thing they say, that, oh, you guys are just, all you guys do here is work, 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 and you won't march, right? And the work ethic was about, you move to another country, you focus on work, because one day you're going back home and building up your house in Sublamar or where have you, right? You're passing through, similar to what Rowan was saying. And I think some of it's about culture and how you express what you've been through and what you do. You work hard. You tell your children, you work 2 times as hard, you go to school. And I mean, that was one of the things I think even to the Gen X generation that was riveted from the pulpit in many experiences. But again, no one has kind of articulated it like that, right? And then also about this mistrust, I think that's happening between the older and the younger, that they're saying, wow, they're talking so much about the social, but they're imbalanced in the spiritual. The same way how we're pointing to say spirit, spirit, spirit. They're just like, well, social, social, social. But I saw somebody say, we need the balance.
Takeaways from our first question was discuss social justice from the pulpit, be it Joseph, be on church, infuse theology with reality, communicate the holistic gospel, and use prayer as strategy, not dismissal.
I think it moves through now to our second topic about, are we abandoning our heritage, our Caribbean connection heritage in terms of the work ethic? Are we embarrassed about our Caribbean heritage? I ask you, are we embracing it? Is there this disconnect, do you think, between the older and the millennials about saying, I am of the Caribbean, or I'm Canadian and I'm just Canadian, even though when you ask that question to the European, the Italians, the Greek, the Asians, they usually speak to their identities of their fathers. But somehow in second, third, we're seeing, so I just throw that out.
When you talk about abandoning the heritage, the first thing that comes to mind is, what is the heritage?
Right.
A lot of, I think, millennials, young people in the Caribbean, predominantly Jamaican churches that we are a part of, what, other than knowing that some of us were born Jamaican, others, our parents were, and we grew up in a household with those strict rules for some of us, and you know what I mean? That part of it we understand, our culture as Jamaicans or Caribbean people. But as for the heritage that we have come up on in the church itself, what does that look like? What is that really? When you look at the worship experience in our Caribbean churches, the music, the sound, those are the things that we consider, I would say, we would consider the heritage, the things, the standards, the rules, you know what I mean? That's how we have, for me personally, have grown up. My pastor, my late pastor, Apostle Samuels, growing up under his leadership, nobody really told you what to do, what to think, how to do it, but it was more like a modeling. What you see us do, you do. So we grew up seeing them press through, fight through, coming to church, being there, putting in all the work, giving their time, their faithfulness. Those are the things, the standards that they lifted up and lived by. That's what we consider a heritage of the Caribbean Black church. It's more of how we conducted ourselves and how we behaved in what we did. So I wouldn't say that we are abandoning our heritage, because that will stay firm. I mean, if we can just build on the shoulders of these men and women that did such great things back then in the time that they did, we're able to build upon that heritage now. It might shift and change and look a bit different in our practices, in our rituals, in our traditions. I think those things change a bit, but as to the heritage, the ground, the pillar of truth, holiness unto God, or watchword and song, sing it, shout it loud and long, like that is going to stand still. That's what we came up under, the standards and the doctrine of the gospel from these Jamaican or Caribbean Black men and women that worked so hard to build these churches and put together this foundation for us. They didn't have it all together. It wasn't all right. But for the things that they did, we can pick out those strong points and stand on that foundation. But when it comes to the rituals, some of the practices, some of the traditions, that's where the millennials come in now and say, you know what, maybe we could change this. Maybe we can do things a little bit different, to be a little bit more out there in the world, and to shine our light, the gospel of Christ in our schools, our homes, our communities, our workplaces. Maybe that's where the change comes in. So we're not abandoning our heritage, but we're trying to understand it, because it was never really told to us. It was something that we saw and you were just supposed to learn. So now we're trying to understand, what does that look like with Dr. Elaine Spencer and the history that you're putting out there, to see some of our pastors that we knew nothing about. We just know that they come from Jamaica, like you said, and it was like, work hard and I'm going to build my local church over here and my 4 people. And that's literally what it was, until they built over 20, 30 years and have moved it throughout the generations. So to abandon our heritage, I would say, no, I don't think we are, as a group of young people. However, it looks differently to us. We weren't back then, right? A lot of young people weren't there, so they don't know what that looked like. But now, in the time and age that we're in, we're going to use the foundation that we've been passed down and build upon that. So the practices, the traditions, the things that we could just leave those in the past. Let's try to change it a little bit, that it can work differently now. So we're not abandoning our heritage, but I believe that we are kind of shifting a bit in our methodology, and just try to keep Christ at the center. That might look a little bit different than it did in 1965. It's 2021, and we're moving with the times in Jesus' name.
Yeah, it better look different, because yeah, we can't be stuck in, I don't know, Makira or anyone else, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in addition to, I don't think it's an abandonment of the heritage, but I think there's an element of discovery for 2nd and 3rd generation Caribbean Canadian Christians, because whereas our foreparents, our grandparents came from Jamaica or from other islands, having a strong sense of, I am a Jamaican. Many, and I'm not sure if any of the panelists can attest, that many within the 2nd and 3rd generation, there's almost this sense of alien identity where you're not Jamaican enough to be Jamaican, but you're not, when you have conversations and you share that you're Canadian, there's always that following question, where are you really from? And I think many people are making sense of what it means to be Jamaican Canadian as a 2nd or 3rd generation. So it's not that there is a shame that is connected to the past, that there is an abandonment. I think that most, if not all of us, are proud of where we hail from, where we come from. but there is a discovery that is taking place because none of us know what it's like to be Jamaican Canadian, having grown up in Canada, except we experience it. And we are born into a time where the shaping of the future is kind of in our hands, really. And it's, what does the future look like in connection to a strong appreciation for where we come from, but also, as Jody shared, an awareness of what may have worked then that probably won't work now. The way I see it, the message of the gospel is the same, but the methods will change. You look at something like the CN Tower when it was made, the landscape has changed significantly, right? Like if there's not effective adaptation and change, I believe there will be extinction, right? But I think that there's a discovery that is taking place, because although we are Canadian, our heritage is our heritage. We can't erase that. We can't run from that. It is who we are. But what does that mean, being born into this context, being raised in this context, especially in a multicultural country like Canada, where most of our friends are probably from different cultures and different ethnicities than us, but we identify in a shared Canadianness? What does that mean to identify as such, but also to hold to some of the elements that inform who we are based on our heritage? So I think it's more so a discovery of what is and what will be, as opposed to a dismissal of what was.
Dr. Spencer, I think for me, like one of the deepest part to your question, I may not be as deep as Jody and McCare, but the one thing that I really hate about the pandemic is convocation patties and food after church. Like, that's one thing about the heritage that I tremendously miss. Dr. Spencer, one thing about our heritage, I'm not going to be deep, but one thing about our heritage is that my wife and I, we still love oxtail and rice and peas. I would take that over any sort of pizza or any sort of food now. So I think that part of the heritage will never be abandoned. I love, even in Alberta, when I used to attend my former church, BUC, man, Sunday after church patties, that's what we look for. That sounds wrong, but it's the truth. We look for over Sunday patties after church. And that's something that's we've been, we run after church to get the first patty. Sister Merle's patties and chicken after church. Oh my goodness. So I think that part of the heritage, it doesn't matter how Canadian I can be. That's one thing I could never abandon. I'm sorry, I just had to add that in there.
Like millennials, like sell your patty and your drinks. You know what I'm saying? And I bet you a lot of you probably even cook like how your parents did, right? But like that was really powerful, even Jody, like how you kind of brought out what not to abandon. And I think Brother McCare, in terms of the discovery, and it's so true, because I think it's an influx, because I think a lot of times, a lot of Caribbeans want the assimilation. They want their children to assimilate. They want their children to be, progressive, and they want them to get good jobs. So sometimes it was about, talk right, do, and so forth. And like you said, it's almost like there's this hybrid, like, what am I? And I think sometimes the forefathers, and as some of them shared, some teary moments, them 70s, 80s, and feeling like the sense of abandonment, that, people don't appreciate, the foundation that was laid. But what I'm hearing from some of them is also that, well, you didn't really tell us, you didn't really communicate, right? Certain things over time. And I think it's that transference that we could work towards. And I think that the heritage it's just the identity. Joel, when you mention about it doesn't start with enslavement, but like when you talk about what's happening in the school system, what they say is because a lot of the youth, they don't have anything to relate to. Tell them about the Black inventors. Tell them about, Africa prior to colonization. And all of a sudden you see the students lighting up. You have more Black, you see them lighting up and so forth. So I think the abandoning of the heritage, I think maybe even for some of the leaders, is about how sometimes they might be perceiving that, oh, maybe they're watering it down. And then there's just this fear about who's going to take over, right? And so I ask you, are millennials helping to solve the problem with this disconnect about social advocacy? What you're kind of identifying, or is it kind of still waiting for the leader to do it all?
Fine. I actually am on slightly the other opposite side, sorry to say. The reason why I am is because I do feel that there is a slight abandonment when it comes to the church sector. When it comes to food, we're all in, we're Jamaican. I think we claim Jamaican heritage when it suits us. So by that I mean is when it comes to, our music, for example, our music is changing. Especially when it comes to, newer planted churches, for example. We're stepping away from, let's say, maybe the dress code that maybe our forefathers would have wanted. I think there is a slight abandonment, and I don't necessarily know if that's a problem. And the reason why I say that is because, and I know you and I spoke about this, in terms of our churches reflecting our communities, I think that we may have to slightly curtail our services different. So for example, if you look at the 60s and 70s, the church had to reflect the community of the church. There was, that was a sense of community for a lot of the Jamaicans back then, right? That the church was where they went to be with family, where they went to be with just a safe community. And majority of those believers, if not all, were Jamaican or Jamaican heritage. So of course, church had to reflect that. But now our churches, I think we need to start reflecting our communities, and our communities are not majority Jamaican. And by communities, I mean in Canada, Ontario, Toronto, right? So for example, me being a praise and worship leader, I can't do all Jamaican songs for praise and worship. It's just not going to work, right? Like if I have visitors we have visitors coming into the church that don't look like me, have a different skin color than me, or they may be Black, but they're not from Jamaica, right? But they may be African. I am going to have to somewhat curtail songs that they're able to understand. So for example, I can't do sweet on a Monday, sweet on a Tuesday. They're gonna be like, what is sweet? I'm confused. What? You know what I mean? Like, a Fimbi Jesus body met me rock. That song is great for Sunday night service. But on a Sunday morning, I may have to curtail the service to be more reflective of the visitors that that's coming into the, to the church. So
sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Go ahead.
Are you sure you're good? Okay.
I'm good.
I was hearing you talk. I think it's important that we make a distinction. When it comes down to the heritage, and that's what I stated first when I spoke, what is that? Like, what do we really identify the Caribbean Jamaican church heritage as? Mm-hmm. Because in that you have rules, standards, you know what I mean? And which is different from assembly to assembly as well. And that's based on leadership, right? So I don't think we're abandoning the heritage, but like I stated before, our worship experience is shifting. We're becoming a little bit more progressive in our worship. So with the music you're speaking of, that's true. That's one point, very, very important, that our music is changing. You can't always just have that whole, like, as a Jamaican Caribbean church, like, we can't just continue to speak patois the entire service. You know what I mean? Like, things like that we're moving from. Like, maybe back then it was predominantly all Jamaicans that just came up, and immigrants that just came. So that was what they did then. But now in these ages that we're in, it's literally us as the millennials and people coming up, they're changing that. So although we're still holding on to our heritage, whether it's of ourselves or parents, whatever was passed down to us, but we're more cognizant of the time that we're in. Like you're saying, the multiculturalism, the people that we see around us in our churches now, we're able to minister to, to feed that soul, that person that's not Jamaican. So even though the music is changing, the sound is changing, I believe the heritage remains the same. However, we're just shifting in the methods and the way that we do things. That's what's shifting. With standards, rules, those now we can look at maybe that we're letting go, some of the things that they had then, but the heritage itself remains. So I think we need to make that distinction as to what, maybe define what are we talking about when we say heritage. It's not rules, right?
Well, if we look at heritage ourselves, those of us that are on the panel tonight, do we know where our forefathers stem from? So we say Jamaica. Okay, do we know what parish? Do we know, you know what I mean? Like, do we know a lot of the history then of our Jamaican culture, if that's what we're talking about?
That's
because
what
I think we've intertwined culture and church culture to be one thing, not.
Right.
So
right.
I think if you're talking about distinction, absolutely. I think I don't know if a lot of our churches have that clear distinction though, Jody. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't
say we don't know what that is. That's what we're trying to find out tonight. What is that? What is
I don't know if I can say we don't know what that is. I just don't think that I think we have intertwined our Jamaican culture to be church culture.
Okay. Yes.
And I think that's okay. Because I think cross-spectrum, cross-denomination, culture is almost part of the worship experience. Anyone that thinks it's divorced from that, no, it's part of it. And church has a culture. And people work through culture. They did in biblical times, the Jews, the Gentiles, right? So I don't think we ever have to have this kind of fight, like, you know, what's Jamaican, what have you. Sometimes I think it's regional, right? If you're out West, I think the experiences there, when I tapped into the history of like the Neils, right? Going to northern parts of Canada and ministering to the First Nations, I was blown away. Because for us in Ontario, we have no concept of ministering to the Indigenous communities. But Elmer Neal and those pastors ministered the gospel, and he's a born Jamaican. So he knew how to navigate that. He knew how to present the gospel, that today there are First Nations people who are baptized in the name of Jesus, filled with the Holy Ghost, because that's the power of the gospel. And I think that God will work through who he will, right? And I think some of what the traditionalists is like a generation name for the older. I think heritage has a lot to do with, you know, not this disdain for what these Caribbeans came here, and maybe they weren't learned, maybe they didn't go to university, right? But when you think of the practicality, like what some of them did, there has to be that appreciation. And so now we take it that step further, right? Because they were very intuitive to know. And I think for the Black church in Canada, we also have to understand that whenever I hear this term multicultural church, I always ask people to point me to the multicultural church where the pastor is Black. It's always a white leader. Why is that? And we got to get really frank about how even in the culture, you can still reach races and so forth. And there's a lot of reasons why white people don't come to Black spaces, for the similar reasons of what we saw last year in the protest. And we're seeing in the evangelical community that we pretended to be together, but yet the sin of racism is still there. So I think the heritage has a lot to do, yeah, the culture, yeah, the music, but that evolves, right? But for them, I think it is standards that is also, right? The cringing when they see, you know, new leaders and maybe they're abandoning head covering. And even though the jury for some might be out on that, that feels like an abandonment. Like we taught you this, right? We shared with you this. Why are you divorcing, even if it's for identity purposes? So I think there's more and more musing of that. I think that, and thinking regionally, because I think Ontario, sometimes we have no idea what is happening across the nation, from Caribbean people who are influencing other cultures, what have you. But I think urban centers like Toronto, there's a lot happening there. But, you know, as we talk about music though.
I think that Joel has something to say before you go anywhere.
Sorry, thank you. I was just gonna say, to add to Elder McCare's point when he was saying it's like a moment of discovery for those of us who are Jamaican Canadian. I do feel, I can only speak of my experience, because I do love and appreciate my Jamaican heritage. However, I'm also Canadian. And I think what happens sometimes in our Jamaican churches is that you feel like it's you're in Canada, but when you've stepped into the church, it's like you're no longer in Canada. Or, and I don't want to say this to offend anybody, because I have nothing wrong with being in a church that is with the Jamaican culture. I do feel like you can still be effective, but just also to recognize that we're still in a Canadian country and we want to be effective in ministry. So we can still have this, certain traditions continue. And I wouldn't even say we have to change, but we can add to our Jamaican culture that is in a Canadian country. And then also too, I can only speak of my experience. When I was in South Korea, I had to now be that foreigner, that individual that didn't have anything to do with the culture around me. And I was still able to feel a part of the worship experience. Because Jesus is not Jamaican, he's not Canadian, he wasn't South Korean either. He's still Jesus. So I found, for me, it's just give the people Jesus. You know what I mean? Sometimes I feel like we work very hard to give you Jesus with a flag. And I think your job as a minister, as a preacher, a teacher, evangelist, whatever have you, is to give the people Jesus. Don't give you Jesus with a flag behind him. You know what I mean? Give them the word as it comes to you, and it should be fine.
So what if that word comes out to you in Patois? You're giving them Jesus based on who you are, right?
Well, like I said, when I was in South Korea, I had to learn the language. And sometimes, I remember one time I had to speak in the congregation with an interpreter. I spoke in English.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're moving in the spirit, it still convicts.
Oh, for sure. I agree with you.
Reach. So if a man is speaking in patois, because that's how he speaks, you know what I mean? But if he's giving the word, I don't think that limits the word reaching someone's heart.
No, it doesn't limit, but in the sense of when you say just give Jesus, I agree with you 100%. We need to do that. But how does that look might differ depending on the individual. If you go into if you go into an Islamic temple, like, you know what I mean? If you go into one of those temples, I'm sure the way that they present their culture is strong in there. If we're in a Jamaican church, the way that we present Christ, you're going to see that culture that we have created. So what I mean when I say that is give them Jesus in patois. If I'm Jamaican and I just came up from the country here to Canada and I'm preaching, I might have an accent, right? So if I'm preaching the word, I'm giving you Jesus, but it sounds, you can hear that Jamaican accent. I'm giving you Jesus and I'm jumping around and worshiping in the charismatic way that we do as a Jamaican Caribbean Black church. Like, so yes, give Jesus, but at the same time, you said like not with a flag on it, but how do you do that without still having your individuality as who you are as a person? How do we give people Jesus if you're in a predominantly Black Jamaican church?
So,
is that not going to come through when you give?
If you're Jamaican, you're Jamaican. I don't think anyone's trying to take that from anybody. If you have a Jamaican accent, you have a Jamaican accent. I think, and this is what I guess I was also saying to Jola, she worded it perfectly. I think what's happening is, I mean, if we were to be completely honest, our churches are not reflecting our communities. And
right.
And I do think that is slightly a problem. Like, I think that there is a problem if we go to our churches and we have recycled brethren going from church to church we don't see any new people getting saved that don't necessarily look like us. I do think that is a problem. And I do think sometimes we don't make it a culture for people to feel, and when I say culture, I mean a church culture that is giving space for people to feel like, yeah, okay, I feel comfortable here. That's not to say that you can't do Jamaican songs. We do Jamaican songs. Right. I just think that we do have to somewhat mix that in for people that may be white, Asian, Indian, that they can fully understand what we're saying. So certain songs, we may have to backbench that to a Sunday night testimony service, for example, right? I think we do have to be aware that this is not a culture. We shouldn't be careful how we mix culture with Christendom is all I'm saying.
But is that our mission to get people from other cultures? Like, is that
Absolutely.
what we want to do?
All
To
the
get
world,
people
not
from
to Jamaica.
Is that
No.
what we want to do, to get other people in?
100% to the
Like-
Gentiles. So I think we can find with that. But again, I think the more we learn about a lot of the ministries across Canada, us in Ontario, our lights will be opened up. That how the Lord used people from the Caribbean to spread this great gospel, and He will continue to do that. And
As we recap, be open to other cultures, try new methods to reach the youth. Heritage is not clearly understood, allow for growth and discovery, and patties and drinks is a must.
is anyone missing church right now as we're on the Zoom platform? Do you miss church? Think about the global pandemic that we're in right now. We've been locked down for how many months? How are people doing? How are the youth doing? How is the Gen Xers? Like, what are you hearing? Do you miss it? Physical church. Yes, the Jamaican physical church of the forefront.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. I have been going to church every week, and I'm sure worship leaders, Najola, Jody, McCarran, I've seen you go to church as well. Like, I think some of us have had to still remain going to church, whether we're doing praise and worship, we're on music, we're, speaking for that Sunday. So I don't know if I've had an opportunity, and understand what I mean when I say this, but I haven't had an opportunity to miss the physical building, just because I've still been going since the pandemic has been hit. However, I think it has definitely taken a toll on me as an extrovert, not being able to connect with church members, not being able to connect with, your church friends. You feel like there is a hole that's there because, you're not able to fellowship after service. I miss, being able to connect with the youth after service. We're touching base. And I think we need the church needs a way to cope from a mental standpoint with that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we need to know how to deal with the feelings of not, loss of connectivity. I think we need to learn, how do we stay connected? Whether we're doing Zoom meetups, whether we're, connecting over the phone, but I think we need things in place to still keep that fellowship and community alive. But I definitely miss church. I miss the worship. I miss worshiping with everyone. I miss the music. I miss those things. And I think you don't realize, the saying goes, you don't realize, you've lost something until it's gone. You don't really realize the impact of something or not having the thing until it's gone. I miss conventions. Like, I was asking my family the other day, is it going to be the same after COVID is gone? Are we going to be able to go back to concerts, conventions? Do we think it's going to be the same? I really don't know. And that's a little scary.
I did a thing on, if you follow me on Instagram, I did a church rewind challenge where I was just reminded, I'm always having my camera in hand, if you know me, when I go to different church events. And I literally went through my entire camera roll, not entire, I still have some, where I was showing videos of church rewind, different events that I've been to over the years, from maybe 2016 all the way up until 2019. And the amount of feedback that I received, I did not know people were going to message me so much about these videos that I was posting over a 3-day span. And the common thing that many said is that they miss the fellowship. They miss their friends. They miss the patty and pop. They miss the food. That was for us, and mind you, it was a lot of young people messaging me, I would say of this, or millennials and younger, that were messaging me and telling me that. So a lot of people miss the fellowship, but I also heard many of them say, I don't really miss church. I don't miss the building, but I miss the friends. I miss the fellowship. I don't miss the yelling and screaming and shouting sometimes that take place, but I miss gathering in the building and having youth, fellowships or going out to eat after a convention. And those are the things that people miss, right? So I think this has given us an opportunity, because for me personally, I miss the fellowship. I don't miss the busyness of church, because I was very busy in church personally for a lot of things that I do. That this is a break. It's a time to really sit back and look at, take an introspection and kind of just look at yourself and look at what you've been doing and all of that stuff. So take a little break, that's fine. However, when we look at the fellowship piece of it, I think a lot of people are suffering because some of them, we only have our church family, we only have our church friends, and we're not getting that in this time. So again, just looking at why is it that a lot of people don't miss conventions? A lot of people don't miss service after service, every month, every week, showing up, popping up. A lot of people don't miss that, but they do miss the fellowship of the brethren and the saints.
Yeah, I think one of the things is like church, although we worship, although there's preaching, although there are all these things, at the core, church really is a community, right? And not being able to have that, I found even just working with youth and with young adults, like a lot of people have expressed that they really struggle with those feelings of isolation. And there's an increase in anxiety, there's an increase in challenges surrounding mental health. And I've been seeing a lot more conversations occurring within the church surrounding that subject. But the community aspect, the fellowship aspect is something that, although you can make use of Zoom, you can make use of some of these other social media forums, you can't replicate that in-person experience. So I found that there's been an increased need to pivot quickly. I think like in March, when everything shut down, everybody had to pivot. But I found that even within that major pivot, there's been a need to reevaluate and to pivot again and again and again. Like the way things were done in April of last year are totally different from the way that some are doing things right now in February of 2021. And there's like that pressure of constantly trying to remain connected. But I mean, like everybody said, I miss church because it can't be replicated. It can't be replicated. There's nothing like having those moments after church where sometimes you'd stay and you'd chill in the foyer for like hours, just talking to your friends, just catching up on people, going out, having dinner, like, and even just the hugs in church, and just like the greetings and those conversations, people checking in on you. Although you can have that through social media or through Zoom, there's still that feeling of disconnect. So there's been an increased need for strategies and for changes to make the most with what we have, but still try to look toward those days when we can get back.
I was just going to say that I did find myself, at one point I felt like I was grieving what has been lost, because I had to come to the realization that some things will just never be the same. I had to accept, and that's just, even with my own experience of loss, I feel like with even now with the church and missing church, I had to come to my own realization that you're going to come back to church. And even when this is done, there are some things that we will not return to. And I think I had to just accept it. And even though I'm still going to hope for certain things to come back, we just have to acknowledge that there's a part of what used to be that will no longer be. So for me, of course you miss conventions, of course you miss conference and the fellowship afterwards. However, it was also enlightening for me to realize that those moments that we had that were fellowship, I don't know, I feel like it also let me know that there are still so much people that I wasn't as connected to within my church family as I should have been. And I only say that because I know that for us, we had to start making calls to check in on the members, certain people in leadership. And so when you're forced, I feel like some of the, I guess the silver lining, for lack of a better word, was just that it forced us to connect with people that we weren't connected with. Because we're so used to after church, there's a certain, it's habitual. You right after church, you go to certain people to talk to, you talk to them for a long time. Even when you go to conventions, it's the same people that you go to, you talk, but were we really in fellowship with you know what I mean? So I think what happened now is the pandemic forced us to face some realities and to strategize, where do we go from here? So now when I'm calling people, sometimes I'm calling the saints, and there's a part of me that's like almost, and I'm just going to be completely honest and transparent, I was almost not looking forward to the call, because I'm like, I don't even know who this is, and it feels like I was a telemarketer, but then some great conversations came out of it. And sometimes I still can't put a face to who I called. And these are people that came every Sunday. So I feel like, in a way, I do miss the church, and I had to grieve that, and I still am accepting what isn't going to be, but it's also going to force me to really do better with fellowship and to do better at connecting with people, because I think a part of the reason why we do feel so alone still as church brothers and sisters in the family of God is because we were alone even when the pandemic wasn't happening. Some of us were isolated. And whether it was your fault or not, we were disconnected, and we were too busy churching to realize that one of our sisters or brothers was in need. You know what I mean? So I feel like it's still an eye opener to that.
But that's even fellowship, I think, on a whole, with our conventions, with our gatherings that we had. Were we really united, or did we just gather? I think that's really a question to ask, because when we used to come together in the same building for conventions and anniversary service and all these things, you had churches visits, and you know how we do, or convention and stuff. But the true unity that we should have had amongst ourselves, that godly fellowship, that where you really feel that there's a connection between the people. Did we really have that in the building? Did we really have those years that when we said, hey, my brother is coming over to visit us today, Sister Elaine Spencer and her family is coming over tonight, and it was just based on the friends. It was just based on who we already had those connections with. But like you're saying, there's so many people now in this time that are still at home alone. They were at home alone, felt alone, had no friends in the church before the pandemic, and they're still feeling the same way. And believe it or not, even within the pandemic, people are feeling that same sense of like, nobody in the church called me. Nobody has checked in to see how I'm really doing, or the people that they're looking to check in has not checked in to see how they're coping with the time. Just that same measurement that we're using, that, hey, as long as you log in, as long as we see you online, you must be doing great. But to find out how people are really doing, have we really that love that we need to show with each other, not just seeing you at church in the building or just seeing you pop up on an online Zoom, but that love and care of the soul of the person. How are you coping? How are you doing? Like, do you need a little money? Do you need some groceries? Do you need medication? These are the things that for me personally, it has highlighted that for me, because it's not just running to your car after church and saying, hey, how you doing? And do little jokes and stuff and running away. Now we're in a whole pandemic. It's a problem. And people, we have to come together as a body, not just running from church to church in conventions, but to show the care, the love of Christ to our brothers and sisters, the true fellowship and connection of God. Like, we need that.
I think that this pandemic, like, if we're looking at some of the benefits of it, it really forced us to go deeper in every way, right? And just speaking to what you guys are saying, the relationships, a lot of what we did, although it was great, there were so many people that were excluded from those connections if they weren't part of a clique. now it's forced us to have deeper and more meaningful relationship. What does relationship look like when we're not in person? What does our relationship with God look like when we're not in the building, right? And I think it was a wake-up call for many Christians that like the relationship that they had with God, it was so intricately tied to being in the building that many didn't know how to function being at home, right? So like I think it's caused us to go deeper relationally. It's caused many of us to examine and to go deeper in our walk with God, and even in the study of the scriptures, but also as you said, like going deeper into some of the needs of those within our congregation, because there's a lot of things that wouldn't come up in those post-church talks, that in the calls, in the check-ins, in the FaceTimes during the pandemic, you're able to see a different side of people that you probably otherwise were not exposed to. You're able to hear of certain things that are going on in their life that they probably wouldn't be as open to share if it was in a larger group setting. And it's forced us and caused us, I would say in a healthy way, to reevaluate what church is, and to see ourselves not so much as going to church, but being the church, meeting the needs of the people, living the gospel, and allowing Christ to still be glorified, even though we're not in the building. And it's been, as much as it's been saddening, like there was a grieving process for me as well, Najola. I think that there has also been a combination of an enlightenment to some degree, in that like there's so much that I've learned, there's so much growth and so much deepening that has occurred during this time.
Like that, because think about the seniors who their everyday, everything they are is about going to Tuesday night service, Wednesday night service, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. They're retired, right? They don't got internet. It's about going to church because that's their outing, and everything's locked down. And you know, and ask the millennials and all of us to kind of even think about the older generation, like how traumatic this transition is. Really difficult. And I think that as you go back to your local assemblies and maybe really kind of think about even the connection to the older, the seniors within our churches, we'd love to hear a young person kind of connect with them. And like Najola says, who are kind of grieving the fact that it's not going to go. When they hear that, it's just like, you mean I have to be on the Zoom call all the time? Or you mean, you know what I'm saying? Whereas you guys can, like the word that we always use, it pivot, pivot, pivot. Not everyone can pivot so easily. So I think.
In recap of missing church, people miss conventions and fellowship. There are struggles with isolation and anxiety. People are grieving, forced to connect in better ways. And it's revealed that people were alone before the pandemic.
But if you were to envision the church of 2030, right? And I always say this to people, we can't just be thinking how it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We use that maybe to be inspired, you know, the history and stuff like that. Moving forward, you know, what does the church of 2030 look like?
So I'm actually quite hopeful. I believe that the church will continue to grow. I think that in addition to individual relationship, we're seeing that there's an increased need for communal relationship, and deeper communal relationship at that. And I've been so blessed to see some of the conversations that have been happening, even some of the things that have been birthed throughout this pandemic. Like I feel as though in some ways it's been embryonic as it has been preparing us for what is coming, and even birthing things out during this time frame. And although many are of the persuasion that millennials or the Gen Z don't love Christ or don't have a desire to serve him, I think that those things will look different. We're going to see, dare I say, we're going to see a return in many ways to the model, to the model of like the Acts church. And I don't just mean in demonstration and in power. I know we're all believing for that, but I mean even in the communal aspect, meeting the needs of the people, ensuring that that not only the spiritual needs are taken care of, but like really pressing into like, how is your soul? How are you doing? Right? Because I've been so amazed to see that even working within like working with Gen Z, like there's a hunger to go into the scriptures, like no gimmicks, no games, but like Bible study, and like people are excited inviting friends to study the scriptures, because for a lot of them, a lot of people didn't grow up like at least with this generation now, like many within this generation, I mean, I think all of us on this panel have had the benefit of being raised in church, being groomed and having an understanding. But a lot of those that we're engaging with now, many of them didn't grow up in church. If their parents did, this is the generation that left their kids at home to fend for themselves while they went to church and took positions. So it's a fresh awakening. It's not even a revival, it's an awakening, because many were never, we talk about woke, many were never woke to the gospel before, but they're encountering it in a fresh way, in a new way. And there's a genuine desire. Some people don't have language for what it is that they're searching for. So you see them trying to fit it with new age, trying to fit it with different things. But when they encounter the risen Christ, it's like a veil is removed, you know. And I'm extremely hopeful. And I'll also say that I believe that the church, the future church, will be significantly more multicultural. And I think that I'll draw the distinction in saying that a lot of times what we refer to as multicultural is more so multi-ethnic. But you look within the black experience in Canada. I think to be black, to be Christian and Canadian is to be inherently multicultural, because you're talking about Jamaicans, you're talking about Trinidadians, you're talking about Ghanaians, Nigerians, so many of us from so many different places coming together, and not dismissing our differences, but inviting our differences into the conversation as we desire to grow in the knowledge of Christ, but also understanding that, you know, like what Paul speaks to in Acts 17, how like out of one blood, Christ has drawn and connected all nations. There's not a dismissal of the fact that we're from different nations, but there is a unity around the fact that there is one blood that connects us together. So, I mean, I genuinely believe, like, I'm not going to ignore the fact that many are leaving, but there are also many that are coming to encounter Jesus for real. And though it may look different, though the building may not be prioritized to the same degree, I do still see a value in it. But I think that there's going to be a lot more things that happen, whether that's like weeknights at somebody's house, like when we're able to open up again, or even just like going out together and having meaningful conversation. Like I'm hopeful, because I think that this time it has really caused us to ask a lot of questions and to realize that there is a lack, there's a deficiency that many have that they couldn't put language to. But when they meet Jesus, they know that there's a God-sized void that only he can fill. So I'm hopeful for the church for 2030.
Oh,
I think our best days are before us.
And someone said to me that they fear that, you know, maybe post-pandemic, you know, 20 years from now, maybe the Black church, as we're calling it tonight, it won't exist. Maybe the building itself won't be there anymore. It's possible that, like we've said before, the way that we used to do church, we won't go back to those things anymore. So the church of 2030, I'm more thinking that it's a possibility that things won't be the same, for sure, we know that. But to the drastic parts, that literally not having a building anymore, my question and concern is then, are we still able to be a Christian, a child of God, without the building? What if 2030 comes and we can't gather in person anymore? Are we still able to profess Christ and to live a life pleasing unto him, right? So we understand the connection between the building and the relationship with God, because a lot of people have like melted those together, right? And to be honest, it's a problem. It worked for what it did. I mean, thank God we had a building to come and go to. Me, myself, over the years, I'm grateful that I was busy in church. It kept me out of trouble. It kept me from doing certain things. And I'm grateful for that. However, there had to be a time where I had to separate God and church. There had to be a time where I had to separate the building and my relationship with God. So to now understand that we are the church, literally, we are the people, the picked out ones, right? So outside of the building, how are we living? Outside of the building, if we never connect again in person, can we still remain the light and the salt of this world? So that's something in this time. I think we need to build our people and get ourselves really ready for what's to come, because maybe we never go back to the building, and some people are waiting for it. They're waiting and praying, and they're on fasting every day, begging God to go back. God is moving us forward, and we're asking him to bring us back into the wilderness, to bring us back where he has delivered us from. So we have to consider that even if the building itself is no longer there, there is a building not made with hands, that Christ now has lived inside of us. And we have to make sure that we are prepared to be the church in the world. That means letting go of certain things that we use the church as to see who we were, and to make people holy or not holy, or saved or not saved. Now it's Christ in us. That's what we have to show. So if 2030 comes and there's no building, I still want my soul to be right with the Lord, that I'm able to impact the world and be salt of this world.
The scripture that comes to mind is, but the God of all grace, who hath called you unto his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. So I feel like this moment that we're in, this pause, we are experiencing suffering, but I feel like God is positioning us that after this, how we sing the song, there will be glory after this. I look forward to how he will make us, the body of Christ, perfect, and then how he will establish us, and then how he will settle us. I feel that I feel like God is going to transition us into different levels, and it only goes higher. What I'm experiencing now within this stage of perfection and establishing, within this process that God is allowing us to be in, I am realizing that on the prayer line, it is not the older officers who are leading. It is the young people who are moderating, who are praying. And even in the Bible studies, before, when we had Bible study and it was when we had to go to church, it was scanty, it was a few. Now I'm seeing there's a host of people, and it's not all the same age. It's now including the millennials. So I feel like this needed to happen so that we would be established. And there is always a remnant. And I feel like this stage needs to happen to prepare us for what is to come. So I trust that we will be settled. We will experience, it's only going to get better. The church is alive and well, but we just have to remember that we have a hope that maketh not ashamed. And we have no reason to fear. I just think that we have to remember that this is not the only time that the church was in trouble. This started from Genesis right down to Revelation. The church is built for this, but the beauty of the church is that we are built on a solid rock. We are solid. Even though we can't enter into the church, we remain steadfast, unmovable. So I'm going to stop right there because I feel, but I'll just stop right there.
Take my time, Najola. Go ahead, finish.
No, I'm done.
I certainly echo everything that's been said. I actually feel very encouraged. I think there was a point during this whole pandemic, this whole quarantine, the initial stages of it all, I felt myself getting into a bout of restlessness. I was anxious. I was feeling down as what's happening, because there was such a level of uncertainty. But I actually feel that, being a part of a leadership family, I actually feel that we've received a little bit of rest. Does that make sense? Like there's just been a time for us to fall back to, come together, to feel refreshed, to feel renewed. And I feel that it has opened up the way a lot more for us to come with fresh ideas, new ideas. How can we bring the gospel even further to the world? This is really given us such a platform to be able to, to expose the church on such a wider scale. Some of us never had to have a church website opened up. Some of us never had to. And so given us so much more access for souls to be reached. And I think that this is the time that we could utilize to spread the gospel even further. And I think, if we're looking years ahead, I would love to see our church go outside and have church outdoors, outside of the four walls. I would love to love to see more of an open air service like we grew up on. I think the world needs to see more of what we have now that we've taken a time to be refreshed, to be renewed, to take the time to really see what can we change, what can we improve upon, because I think that's important. I think now, even more so, we know that God is coming even more so. And if we would simply just use the tools that he's given us, use the gifts that he's given us to express this gospel, to expose people that would never have had an opportunity to hear what it is that we have to say. I think that's what's so important. We have people coming on live stream that are in India. When would I have had an opportunity to express the gospel to someone in India? I think this is such an awesome time for the church, because I think that it's given us an opportunity to go into all the world. That's the Great Commission, and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I'm actually excited. I feel like this is a great time for the church, for us to step back, to come back to the drawing board. I can't wait to see what's going to happen after this. Greater things are ahead. So I'm excited.
And in our final question on Church of 2030, better days are ahead. Youth are leading in prayer. Church is more than a building. Church is outside the four walls, and there's hunger for biblical instruction.
I feel encouraged. I feel empowered that even though through, as we kind of circle through the issues and topics, but at the end of it, right, we're grounded, we're rooted, we know we are hoping in God. We're hoping against hope that everything is going to be all right. I think if we were in a physical building, I think we know what we'd be doing right now. I know I'd be screaming and hollering because I feel it way down in my soul right now. And I want to encourage every millennial, every older person, younger person to keep the faith. Do not let go. We are having this series of conversations to connect the body of Christ. Tonight, it's the millennials. Next Thursday night, it's the Gen Xers, those who are in their mid-50s, those who grew up, who have other perspectives, because this is kingdom. And as I've been talking all night, this is the book encyclopedia, the Black Church in Canada, an excellent resource for those who want to really dig into the heritage and our history, 100 years of history here across the Caribbean diaspora. Also support our young people. Did you know that we have young Zs who have actually written an illustrative book about our heroes of faith? Really, really good resource for those in Sunday school ministries, youth ministries. It's called Heroes of Faith. You can find that on my website. But we want to inspire this generation that even though you may feel the disconnect, even though you may feel, where do I fit? We didn't touch on succession, right? Who are the leaders? But you're the leaders of today. Work with your local church, work with your leaders, work with your pastors, and let's not segment the generations, you know what I mean? We are all going to the same place. And where is that? Heaven is our home. Thank you for the impartation. Thank you for saving us, oh God. You're the God of yesterday, today, and forevermore. And we thank you that you're raising up a generation, hallelujah, to contribute and continue in the baton that is being passed on until you should return. Inspire those seeking to go back to school. Inspire those who have been impacted by racial oppression. But in the name of Jesus, let them know that they can do all things through Christ that strengthens them. God, we are committed to go all the way with you. We pray that you will
Purchase your copy of The Black Church in Canada at kaleoproduction.com. Subscribe at Dr. Lane Spencer on YouTube for weekly interviews and panel discussions.